My father's death pushed us apart, but my spoiled sister took it to the next level. Now I'm alone. Reddit family. In today's Reddit family story, we dive deep into the complexities of a toxic sibling rivalry and the devastating effects of family favoritism. This heartbreaking tale sheds light on how a family, once close-knit, starts to unravel due to manipulation, betrayal, and emotional tolls. Join us as we explore this emotional journey, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe to Silent Wars for more gripping Reddit family stories. Stay tuned till the end. Growing up, I always felt like I was living in the shadow of my sister Nancy, who was my mother's golden child. Despite the fact that my brother Damon and I often worked hard for our achievements, Nancy seemed to get everything handed to her on a silver platter. It wasn't just the material things that set her apart, it was the constant stream of praise, attention, and the total absence of consequences for her actions. This favoritism created a toxic environment in our home that shaped my entire childhood. Even when Nancy misbehaved, my mother would laugh it off as though it were no big deal. And if Damon or I expressed discomfort or hurt because of her behavior, we were told we were just being overly sensitive. This attitude from my mother made me feel invisible, like my emotions didn't matter compared to Nancy's whims. As children, Damon and I were frequently on the defensive. While our father sometimes tried to mediate, his efforts never seemed to be enough to change the underlying dynamic. He would often step in to challenge Nancy's behavior, but more often than not, he would back down to keep the peace, especially in front of my mother. This left us feeling unsupported and, at times, like we were the outsiders in our own family. Nancy's sharp tongue and ability to pinpoint our insecurities were constant sources of tension. Her cruel remarks about my appearance and Damon's career choices didn't just sting in the moment, they planted seeds of doubt in my mind that grew over the years. One particular incident stands out. I remember being about 12 years old, excited about some new clothes I had received. I thought they were flattering, but Nancy wasted no time tearing me down. She made a comment about how they made me look even wider than usual, and my mother didn't defend me. Instead, she dismissed it with a simple, "Oh, Nancy, don't be silly," as if my humiliation didn't matter. I learned quickly that nothing I did could ever match up to Nancy's charm in my mother's eyes. The more I grew, the more I realized how much of our family dynamic revolved around my mother's unconditional support for Nancy, no matter how hurtful or unkind she was. As the years went on, the divide between Nancy and the rest of us only grew. There was a constant undercurrent of tension, and the lack of support from my mother made it unbearable. Even when my father passed away, Damon and I made a conscious decision to step back from the toxic environment. We tried to stay in touch with our mother and Nancy, but the relationship felt strained and forced. It wasn't long before we stopped visiting or calling unless it was absolutely necessary. The emotional toll was just too high, and we began to accept that we were better off maintaining distance. Things didn't change much after Dad's death. Nancy continued to live her life without responsibility, and my mother kept enabling her behavior. It wasn't until Damon had a serious accident that I had to step in. Despite our dysfunctional family, I couldn't let my brother face financial hardship. So I helped cover his medical bills, physiotherapy, and the cost of hiring a nurse. But this act of kindness would soon become the catalyst for a conflict that I never anticipated. Nancy, with her sense of entitlement, demanded financial help from me. She wanted me to pay for a penthouse apartment, an extravagant request, given her lack of a real job and the financial burden she had placed on our family over the years. I was left stunned and furious. For years, Nancy had belittled me and made cruel remarks, and now she was demanding that I support her lavish lifestyle. I could barely contain my anger as I told her no, and when she accused me of favoritism, I knew I had finally reached my breaking point. The conversation quickly turned into a heated argument, and I ended up hanging up the phone on her. Her entitlement, coupled with my mother's guilt trip, pushed me further away. My mother tried to manipulate me, claiming I owed Nancy for the way I had been raised, but I wasn't buying it anymore. I was done with the toxic manipulation. After that confrontation, my fiancé Andrew, who had been incredibly supportive throughout the ordeal, helped me understand the full scope of the dysfunction in my family. It was then that I made the decision to cut all ties with my mother and Nancy. Despite the guilt I felt for not adhering to the societal expectation that family should always come first, I knew I had to protect my own well-being. The final straw came when Nancy tried to sabotage my wedding by spreading lies and encouraging other family members not to attend. But, even in the face of this betrayal, I realized how much better my life had become. Andrew was a loving and supportive partner, and the family I was creating with him was nothing like the dysfunctional one I had left behind. Ultimately, this story is a reminder that family should never be a source of pain, and that sometimes you have to make the difficult decision to distance yourself from toxic people, even if they are family. Growing up, I always felt like I was never quite enough. My sister Nancy, the youngest of us three, was always treated like the golden child in our family. It was hard to pinpoint exactly when it started, but from a young age, Nancy was the center of my mother's attention. She was coddled and given more praise than anyone else, no matter what she did or how she acted. As the oldest sibling, I often felt invisible, overshadowed by Nancy's charm and the overwhelming favoritism she received from both of our parents, particularly our mother. My brother Damon, who is 2 years older than Nancy, and I were the ones who had to deal with the emotional cost of being in her shadow. Nancy was the child who could do no wrong. If she said something cruel, my mother would brush it off, claiming that we were being overly sensitive. But we knew the truth. Nancy enjoyed making us feel small. I remember a time when I was 12, excited about a new outfit I had gotten. Nancy took one look at me and mocked me, saying that the clothes made me look wider than usual. I was devastated, but my mother didn't defend me. Instead, she laughed it off. I felt humiliated, and it wasn't the first time something like that happened. Over time, I came to expect little to no support from my mother, especially when it came to standing up for me against Nancy's hurtful comments. Nancy's behavior didn't just affect me, it impacted my brother Damon as well. She was relentless in her criticism of our life choices, careers, and personal ambitions. For example, at a family Thanksgiving dinner, Damon was proudly discussing his literary degree and his desire to become a writer. Nancy, without hesitation, belittled him in front of the entire extended family, calling him an unemployed burden. I remember the uncomfortable silence that followed, and how my father, who usually tried to mediate, barely spoke up. My mother, however, didn't intervene at all. She just smiled at Nancy's outburst as if it were no big deal. That moment, like many others, made it clear to Damon and me that we were not the favored children. As the years passed, the tension in our family only grew. My father, despite his attempts to keep the peace, was not able to change the deep-rooted dynamics in our home. When he passed away 8 years ago, the situation only worsened. Damon and I tried to maintain some contact with our mother and Nancy out of a sense of duty, but the conversations were always forced and uncomfortable. We would see them during holidays or family gatherings, but the interactions were brief and emotionally exhausting. It became clear that maintaining any sort of relationship with them was damaging to our mental health. So, we started distancing ourselves. It wasn't that we didn't care, it was just that the emotional cost was too high, and we needed to protect ourselves. Things took a turn when Damon had a serious accident a few years ago, and I decided to help him out with his medical bills and recovery. He had been struggling financially, and his injuries left him unable to work. I helped cover his medical expenses and even hired a nurse to assist him during his recovery. But this act of kindness inadvertently set a dangerous precedent. A few weeks later, Nancy, out of nowhere, called me with an outrageous request. She wanted me to help her pay for a luxury penthouse apartment. Nancy, who had never shown any interest in a stable career or contributing to the family in any meaningful way, demanded that I support her lavish lifestyle. She argued that since I had helped Damon, it was only fair that I help her too. I was stunned by her audacity. I had not spoken to her in years without being belittled or insulted, and now she was asking for a large sum of money? I immediately refused. I tried to explain that Damon's situation was an emergency, but Nancy didn't care. She screamed at me, accusing me of being biased toward Damon and playing favorites. She had the nerve to claim that I owed her this money because I was the oldest sibling. But I wasn't going to be manipulated anymore. Nancy's demands, combined with her total lack of self-awareness, pushed me to my breaking point. I finally told her that I wasn't her personal bank and that if she wanted a penthouse, she needed to get a real job. The situation escalated quickly. Nancy was furious and continued to berate me, but I was done. I ended the conversation and refused to take any more calls from her. My mother, as expected, took her side. She tried to guilt-trip me, claiming that I owed Nancy because of my upbringing. But I knew better. I had been made to feel inferior my entire life, and I wasn't going to let that happen anymore. I told my mother that I owed them nothing, that I had my own life to live, and I was done with the toxic family dynamic. The final straw came when my mother messaged my fiancé Andrew, trying to manipulate him by telling her side of the story. But Andrew, after hearing my side and understanding the full history of our family, stood by me. He even apologized for initially not fully grasping the situation. He came to see the toxic dynamic for what it was. Together, we made the decision to cut all ties with my mother and Nancy. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary for our well-being. Since then, my life has improved dramatically. I am happy, successful, and about to marry the love of my life, Andrew. Nancy and my mother may be in turmoil, but I am finally free from their toxicity. This chapter of my life has taught me that sometimes, breaking away from toxic family members is the healthiest decision you can make. Growing up, my family dynamics were anything but ideal. My sister Nancy was always treated as the golden child, a position that left both my brother Damon and me constantly battling feelings of inadequacy. It wasn't just that she got more attention or praise, it was the way my mother especially enabled her behavior. From the time Nancy was young, she received special treatment that made it nearly impossible for Damon and me to feel like we belonged in the same family. It was as if we were always fighting for the smallest amount of affection and approval, while Nancy cruised by with little consequence for her actions. Nancy's behavior ranged from hurtful to outright cruel, but no matter what she did, my mother would turn a blind eye. I recall one incident that perfectly encapsulated how skewed the family's dynamics were. At 12 years old, I was excited about a new outfit I had purchased, but Nancy, always quick to tear me down, mocked me for looking wider than usual. Instead of defending me, my mother just laughed it off as though it were a harmless joke. This kind of behavior continued throughout our childhood, and as we got older, it became more obvious that Nancy could do no wrong. In contrast, Damon and I were constantly criticized and belittled, particularly in front of our extended family. Thanksgiving dinners were often the setting for Nancy's verbal attacks. I remember one family dinner where Damon, excited about his literary degree, shared his love of reading and his aspirations to write. Nancy, without skipping a beat, called him an unemployed burden right there in front of everyone. The uncomfortable silence that followed was deafening. While my father, who often tried to keep the peace, grumbled about Nancy being out of line, my mother just smiled, as though the whole incident didn't matter. It was clear to Damon and me that this behavior was tolerated, if not outright endorsed, by our mother. As the years went by, things only got worse. My father, despite being the one to occasionally mediate, passed away 8 years ago. His death was the catalyst for a slow unraveling of our family ties. Damon and I, already distant from our mother and Nancy, began to pull away even more. It wasn't an abrupt decision. It happened gradually. The strained interactions we had with them, forced phone calls and uncomfortable visits, led us to the conclusion that it was better to distance ourselves than to keep putting ourselves through the emotional toll of interacting with them. The defining moment came when Damon had a serious accident a few years ago. With mounting medical expenses, I made the decision to help him. Damon, always fiercely independent, initially resisted, but I insisted. I covered his medical bills, his physiotherapy, and even hired a nurse to assist him. It was a no-brainer to me. I loved my brother and wanted to support him through a difficult time. But this decision inadvertently set a dangerous precedent. A few weeks later, Nancy called, and what she asked for left me utterly stunned. She wanted financial assistance to purchase a penthouse apartment. Not just any apartment, but a luxury penthouse, despite her being financially unstable and having no stable career. She argued that since I had helped Damon, it was only fair that I help her too. This was the same sister who had relentlessly mocked my appearance and belittled my achievements, and now she had the audacity to ask for money to fund her extravagant lifestyle. I was furious. I refused without hesitation, and when I tried to explain that Damon's situation was an emergency and hers was a luxury choice, Nancy didn't care. She screamed at me, accusing me of playing favorites and being unfair. I couldn't believe the level of entitlement she had. I ended the call abruptly, and when she kept calling back, I ignored every single one of her attempts to manipulate me further. The situation escalated when my mother called. She, too, tried to guilt-trip me, saying that I owed Nancy because of my upbringing, but I knew better. I had endured years of favoritism and emotional neglect from her, and I wasn't about to let Nancy manipulate me into funding her lavish desires. I told my mother that I owed them nothing, and that Nancy could figure it out on her own. It wasn't long before my mother, unable to reach me, turned to my fiancé Andrew, trying to manipulate him into seeing her side. But Andrew, after hearing my version of events and understanding the full history of my family, stood by me. Together, we made the decision to cut ties with my mother and Nancy for good. The relief I felt was immediate. Finally, I was free from the toxicity that had defined my relationship with them for so long. Since that moment, I have found peace. I am engaged to Andrew, a man who has shown me what love and support truly mean. Nancy and my mother may be in turmoil, but I am happy. I am successful, and I am finally able to live the life I've always deserved. Growing up in a family that appeared normal on the surface but was deeply divided beneath it all was something I became acutely aware of over time. My brother Damon and I had to contend with the reality of our sister Nancy being treated like the golden child by our mother. No matter what we did, no matter how hard we tried, Nancy was always the center of attention. It wasn't just the extra praise or the special privileges she received, but also the way she was allowed to get away with anything. I remember my father, who, despite his imperfections, occasionally trying to call her out on her behavior. However, my mother always turned a blind eye to it, and he never pushed back hard enough to change the situation. Nancy's behavior was nothing short of manipulative. She knew how to make others feel small, and she did it without any regard for their feelings. She would exploit our insecurities, often making cruel comments in front of the family. I remember one Thanksgiving, Damon was talking about his literary degree and the work he was passionate about. He was excited to share his thoughts, but Nancy interrupted him, calling him an unemployed burden. The entire room fell silent, and while our father muttered a mild disapproval, my mother just smiled indulgently. That was how it always went. Nancy could do no wrong, and the rest of us were constantly left to deal with the fallout. Despite the years of emotional abuse, it wasn't until my father passed away that Damon and I realized how far the rift between us and our mother had truly grown. He had been the only one who had tried to keep the family together, but after his death, there was no longer anything holding us together. The distance between us and our mother became more intentional with each passing year. We still attended family gatherings, but only out of obligation. The interactions became more strained, and every visit or phone call was a reminder of why we distanced ourselves in the first place. It was clear that our mother favored Nancy, and we began to feel like outsiders in our own family. We had come to accept the fact that our mother would never change, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. The breaking point for me came when Damon suffered a terrible accident. While he was between jobs and struggling with his recovery, I offered to help him with his medical expenses. Damon, being fiercely independent, initially refused, but I insisted. I didn't want him to waste his savings when his online magazine was about to launch. It was a gesture of love and support, one I thought would never come back to haunt me. A few weeks later, Nancy called me out of nowhere, asking for a large sum of money to buy a penthouse apartment. This wasn't just a small request, it was a demand for a luxury lifestyle she couldn't afford. She argued that since I had helped Damon, it was only fair that I help her too. The audacity of the request left me stunned. The last time we had spoken, Nancy was belittling my life choices, criticizing my appearance, and making cruel comments. And now, out of nowhere, she was asking for financial help to fund her lavish desires. I refused, and when I did, Nancy exploded in anger. She accused me of favoring Damon and not supporting her as the oldest sibling. Her entitled attitude was more than I could bear. This wasn't just a simple disagreement, it was a manifestation of everything that had been wrong in our family for years. It was about Nancy's inability to see beyond her own needs and my mother's blind support for her. The conversation ended abruptly, and soon after, my mother called, defending Nancy's actions. She guilt-tripped me, claiming that I owed them because of my upbringing. But I had had enough. I knew I owed them nothing. I was tired of carrying the weight of their manipulative behavior. I blocked both of them on every platform and made it clear that I was done with the toxic dynamic. This decision was not made lightly, but it was necessary for my mental and emotional well-being. And as for my relationship with Andrew, my fiancé, he stood by me, offering his unwavering support throughout it all. Together, we had built a life based on mutual respect and love, something I had never experienced growing up. With him by my side, I realized that I could let go of the toxic people in my life and embrace the family I had always deserved. Growing up, my family's dynamics were anything but normal. My sister Nancy was always the golden child, the one who received all the praise, all the attention, and all the favoritism from our mother. I've often wondered if this treatment was because Nancy was the youngest and, perhaps, a surprise child who came much later than me and my brother Damon. From the moment she could talk and walk, it was clear that she would always get more. Our parents, particularly my mother, never saw the harm in this, even when it was clear that it created a divide in the family. Nancy had a special way of making everyone else feel inferior. Whether it was commenting on my weight or Damon's career choices, she always had something hurtful to say. It was never just the words. It was the tone, the look in her eyes, the satisfaction she seemed to derive from seeing us hurt. For instance, I remember when I was 12, I was so excited about a new outfit I had gotten. I thought it looked good, but Nancy took one look at me and, without hesitation, told me it made me look even wider than usual. Mom just laughed it off and said, "Oh, Nancy, don't be silly." But I felt humiliated. Those moments became frequent, and the emotional toll it took on Damon and me was hard to put into words. The fact that our father, who was the only one in the family who ever tried to stand up to Nancy, had to be the mediator between us, made the situation even worse. While Dad did try to smooth things over, he never made it clear to Mom that her favoritism was wrong. It left Damon and me feeling like we were always fighting an uphill battle. And then, when Dad passed away, it was as if the very foundation of our family crumbled. Without him around to keep the peace, the divide between Nancy, Mom, and us only deepened. The distance between us and Mom became more intentional as the years passed. Initially, we still made efforts to reach out, mostly out of a sense of obligation, but those attempts were often met with silence, or, worse, passive-aggressive comments that reminded us why we had distanced ourselves in the first place. Mom would constantly bring up Nancy's achievements, real or imagined, while brushing off our successes. Even when Damon got a promotion or I completed a major project at work, Mom found a way to shift the spotlight back to Nancy. It was as though our accomplishments didn't matter at all. Eventually, Damon and I stopped trying altogether. Our phone calls became fewer, and when we did see each other at family gatherings, we would try to make our interactions as brief as possible. There was nothing left to salvage, and continuing to force ourselves into these situations felt like an emotional drain. We chose to focus on our own lives and well-being instead of trying to fix what was clearly broken. And then, just when I thought the toxicity of our family was a thing of the past, Nancy made an unexpected demand. A few months ago, after I helped Damon with his medical bills following a serious injury, Nancy called and asked me for a huge favor. She wanted me to help pay for a penthouse apartment. It wasn't just any apartment, it was an expensive, luxurious penthouse, one that she claimed she deserved because she was embarrassed to still be living with Mom. The audacity of her request stunned me, and I immediately rejected her. This wasn't about me being unwilling to help her, it was about her entitlement. She hadn't even made any effort to show that she was trying to help herself. She was living off Mom, and now she was asking me to fund her luxurious lifestyle just because I had helped Damon. Nancy went off on a rant, accusing me of being biased toward Damon, and even said that it was my responsibility as the eldest sibling to support her too. The nerve. It was as though she had no concept of what real struggle was. Meanwhile, I had spent years putting up with her cruelty, and now she wanted me to support her in buying a penthouse? That was the breaking point for me. I told her flat out that I was not going to support her expensive habits. She could get a job or make do with what she had. The conversation quickly escalated into a full-blown argument, with Nancy yelling at me and calling me ungrateful. But this time, I wasn't going to back down. I told her I owed her nothing and hung up. Later, Mom called, but her tone was no different. She accused me of being unfair and reminded me that I had always been given the short end of the stick in the family. That was the final straw. I was done with the guilt trips and the manipulation. I blocked both of them and made it clear that I would no longer tolerate their toxic behavior. The decision to cut ties with my family wasn't easy, but it was necessary for my own mental health. Since then, I've found peace and clarity. And most importantly, I've been able to focus on my relationship with Andrew, who has been incredibly supportive throughout this ordeal. For many years, I was caught in a web of family dysfunction, all stemming from my younger sister Nancy, who had always been the golden child. The favoritism she received from our mother was not subtle, it was glaring, and it was always there. From the moment she was born, Nancy was the center of my parents' world. I've often wondered if her status as the surprise child, the one who came much later than me and my brother Damon, was the reason for the extra attention. Whatever the reason, she was treated differently, and it created a rift in our family that only grew wider as we got older. Growing up, It was impossible not to feel the divide. Damon and I, the older siblings, were always sidelined in favor of Nancy. Her behavior often went unchecked, and when she made cruel remarks, something she did often, our mother would laugh it off. If we ever tried to voice how hurtful her words were, Mom would accuse us of being overly sensitive. No matter how often Nancy belittled us, it was always a joke in Mom's eyes. It didn't help that Nancy was conventionally attractive, which made her insults seem more damaging. When someone regarded as beautiful insults you, it's harder to brush it off. There were many instances of Nancy's cruelty remarks about my weight, Damon's career choices, and anything she could find to make us feel small. But one particular moment stands out in my mind. I was about 12 years old and I had just received new clothes that I was really excited about. But Nancy looked at me and said, "It makes you look even wider than usual." I remember the heat in my cheeks from the humiliation. Mom just laughed it off, but I felt worthless. That was the pattern. Nancy's insults, Mom's laughter, and Damon and I silently absorbing the blows. Our father, who in many ways was the glue that held the family together, occasionally tried to mediate. He would sometimes speak up against Nancy's behavior, but it was always half-hearted. He allowed things to go on, and over time, it became evident that Mom was not willing to stand up to Nancy. She simply indulged her. After our father's death, things began to deteriorate even further. Damon and I, already distanced from Mom and Nancy, chose to pull away completely. We still saw them during rare family events, but the emotional cost of maintaining contact was simply too much. We began to avoid them intentionally, and the distance became a relief. Then, a few years ago, Damon suffered a terrible accident, and his medical bills started to pile up. I helped him, of course, because he's my brother and I care about him deeply. But what happened next was both shocking and infuriating. Nancy, who had never shown any genuine concern for Damon or me, suddenly called and asked me to help her pay for a penthouse apartment. She said she was embarrassed to still be living with Mom at 28, and that, since I had helped Damon, it was only fair that I help her too. The audacity of the request left me speechless. We hadn't even had a meaningful conversation in years, and now she expected me to fund her extravagant lifestyle? I told her no, I wasn't going to enable her sense of entitlement. She went off on me, accusing me of playing favorites and of being biased toward Damon. But I stood firm. I reminded her that I wasn't a bank and that she could get a job or stay with Mom until she figured things out. That conversation ended with her yelling at me, and I hung up. What followed was a series of manipulative attempts by both Nancy and Mom. Mom called me, accusing me of being unfair to Nancy, and used the classic guilt trip. She even went so far as to say that Nancy's lifestyle was my responsibility. That was when I snapped. I told her that I didn't owe her or Nancy anything. My life was my own, and I wasn't going to let them continue to manipulate me. I blocked both of them and cut off all contact. The relief I felt was immediate, but it also came with a strange guilt. I started to question whether I was doing the right thing. But then, through the support of my partner Andrew, and the encouragement I received from others online, I realized I was making the right choice for my own mental health. This decision was about me taking control of my life and not allowing the toxic patterns from my childhood to continue. Now, as I prepare for my wedding to Andrew, I've never felt more at peace. I've finally broken free from the chaos that Nancy and my mother created. I'm no longer their pawn, and I'm ready to build the life I've always deserved. Growing up, my life was overshadowed by the constant manipulation and favoritism that my sister Nancy received from our mother. She was always considered the golden child, while my brother Damon and I were forced to navigate the emotional neglect that came from being relegated to the background. The dynamic in our family was skewed, with Nancy always placed on a pedestal and allowed to get away with things that Damon and I would never have dreamed of. It was clear to me from an early age that I would never be able to escape her influence or the preferential treatment she received from Mom. Nancy was the youngest, arriving much later than Damon and me. I've always felt that her status as the surprise child contributed significantly to the unequal treatment she received. Since she could walk and talk, she was given more of everything: attention, praise, and, most crucially, forgiveness. Even when she misbehaved or said something hurtful, there were no consequences. Mom would laugh it off, dismissing her behavior as if it were nothing more than a joke. It hurt me deeply, especially when Nancy's cruel remarks were ignored or brushed off. I grew up feeling inadequate, as though no matter how hard I worked, I would never be able to measure up to her. The emotional toll of constantly being compared to Nancy was immense. I began to believe that I was not as good as others, especially as I watched how much our mother celebrated Nancy's every accomplishment, no matter how minor, while Damon and I were left to fend for ourselves. It seemed that no matter how well Damon and I did, we could never escape the shadow of Nancy's golden status. Mom's favoritism made it worse, and whenever we tried to speak up about the way we were treated, Mom would shut us down, calling us overly sensitive or insisting that Nancy was just joking. But it wasn't a joke. Nancy's cruelty was deliberate, and she took pleasure in making us feel small. Things didn't improve as we got older. Nancy's cruel behavior continued, and Mom's enabling actions only added fuel to the fire. I still remember the Thanksgiving dinner when Nancy publicly insulted Damon for his career aspirations, calling him an unemployed burden in front of the entire extended family. Mom didn't even scold Nancy for it. Instead, she smiled indulgently as if it were a harmless remark. Meanwhile, Damon and I were left to swallow our hurt in silence. Nancy's insults became routine, targeting my appearance, my work ethic, and even my relationships. I grew tired of being humiliated by someone who claimed to be my sister. Eventually, Dad tried to step in, but his efforts were often half-hearted. He would occasionally try to mediate, but he didn't have the same emotional influence that Mom did. After his passing, the family fractured further. Damon and I began to distance ourselves from Mom and Nancy, a process that started slowly but eventually became an active decision. We stopped attending family gatherings, avoiding phone calls and visits as much as possible. It wasn't about disrespecting Dad's memory. It was about protecting ourselves from the emotional toxicity that had consumed our lives for so long. Things took an unexpected turn when Damon suffered a major accident and required extensive medical treatment. As his medical bills piled up, I volunteered to help him financially. It wasn't about the money, it was about supporting my brother, who had always been there for me despite everything. But that gesture of kindness would soon backfire. A few weeks later, Nancy called me, asking for a large sum of money to pay for a luxury apartment. She claimed it was only fair since I had helped Damon. But the request stunned me. Nancy had never shown any genuine concern for me or Damon, and now, out of the blue, she was demanding financial assistance for her lavish lifestyle. I refused. I wasn't going to fund her sense of entitlement. That was the moment when everything came crashing down. Nancy couldn't handle my rejection and accused me of playing favorites. Mom joined in, calling me unfair and demanding that I support Nancy. The emotional toll of these demands was too much to bear. I finally told them both that I owed them nothing and that their manipulation had gone on long enough. I blocked them both from my life and walked away. Despite the guilt I felt initially, the relief I experienced afterward was profound. For the first time in my life, I was standing up for myself and refusing to be manipulated by toxic family dynamics. I learned that sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to cut ties with people who continually bring you down, even if they are family. One of the most powerful lessons we can learn from this story is the importance of setting boundaries and protecting our emotional well-being, even when it means distancing ourselves from family. For many, family can be a source of love and support, but it can also be a source of hurt and manipulation. The story highlights how the protagonist, after years of enduring emotional mistreatment, finally found the strength to walk away from toxic family dynamics. In life, especially as we age, it becomes crucial to recognize when relationships are no longer healthy or fulfilling. It's essential to protect ourselves from individuals who continually undermine our self-worth, and sometimes that means making difficult decisions like setting boundaries or even cutting ties. This is not a decision to be taken lightly, but it can lead to greater peace of mind and emotional freedom. As we grow older, our time and energy become even more precious, and it's important to invest them in relationships that bring joy, mutual respect, and understanding. Sometimes, the greatest act of self-care is learning to say no to those who take advantage of us and yes to the relationships that nurture us. It's never too late to reclaim your happiness and prioritize your well-being. Thank you for watching this Reddit family story. We hope you could relate to the challenges faced in the story, and remember, family dynamics can be tough. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to Silent Wars for more captivating stories. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you in the next video.